Welcome to the Plant Trainers Podcast, where we're helping people improve their quality of life through nutrition and fitness. And now, your hosts, nutrition and wellness coaches, international speakers, Adam and Shoshana Chaim.
Hey, I'm Adam Chaim.
And I'm Shoshana Chaim, and we are
Propelled by Plants. Today we bring to you episode 219, Probiotics and Fermentation with the HappyGutMD, Dr. Will Bulsiewicz.
In today's episode of the Plant Trainers Podcast, we talked to Dr. Will Bulsiewicz, the HappyGutMD, about prebiotics, probiotics, fermentation, and, well, your gut. We share some extremely interesting facts about the foods that we eat and how they affect our gut and the role they play in our overall health. We also discuss prebiotics and dive into the good and the bad aspects of fermented foods. You'll be able to hear Dr. B smile from ear to ear when he talks about sauerkraut, and he gives us step-by-step instructions on how to make your own at home.
Dr. B is a plant-based board-certified gastroenterologist and gut health expert. He's a graduate of Georgetown University School of Medicine. He trained in internal medicine at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and he trained in gastroenterology, hepatology, and nutrition at the University of North Carolina. He also received a Master's of Clinical Investigation from Northwestern University and has a certificate in nutrition from Cornell University. Dr. B has a special interest in nutrition, the gut microbiome, and integrative gastroenterology.
Diets. They've been plaguing people for years. They start off good because everybody's excited about new beginnings. We eat well for a few days or maybe a few weeks, but we neglect to look at the patterns in life that causes us to make those choices from the beginning. That's what's different about working with us to gain control of the foods that you eat and the life that you're living. It's more than just what you put on your plate. We'll help you change your behaviors, make small changes, and figure out the patterns that have kept you from really being able to move forward with your health so that you could finally relax and enjoy a healthier life.
Are you ready to make changes in your life that'll actually last? Are you ready to commit to yourself and become the person you deserve to be? Are you ready to feel good, to feel healthy, because you realize your time is now? Send us an email at info@planttrainers.com. We'll hop on the phone with you to hear more and figure out how we can help you get to where you want to be, and together we'll improve your quality of life through nutrition and fitness. And now for a moment of gratitude.
There's been a series of weather incidences throughout North America, and I'm just very grateful that everybody I know is okay and safe and is getting over all the damages that had occurred.
If you've been following our Instagram stories, you know that in the month of September, I ran over 400 kilometers, and it's kind of crazy, but it happened. I'm just grateful for the fact that my body was able to recover as quickly as it did and allows me to have those opportunities to run. We're in October now. I don't know what my goals are going to be, but my body feels great and I'm just going to keep doing what I like doing.
Dr. Bulsiewicz, or Dr. B, as we like to call you. How are you doing tonight? Welcome to the Plant Trainers Podcast.
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be on your podcast. You guys are doing amazing things with this, so it's super cool.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that. We wanted to know if you have a moment of gratitude that you'll share with us and our listeners.
I love that you guys do this, and this is such an easy thing for me. And maybe it's possible that this is what everyone says, but I'm just so grateful for my family. So, it's an amazing thing when you find yourself in this place where you can't wait to get home after work every day and you love every moment that you have with your wife and with your kids. And, I think that's when you know that you're in the right relationship, the right situation. And it's just like one of these things where, I feel blessed to have something that you just can't buy with money. And so that sounds cliche, but I think, at the end of the day, it's just so easy to get drawn into other things like power or success or money. But, life is about relationships, and that's the bottom line.
I don't think it's cliche. I think it's totally all right to say something like that. And I don't think enough people actually take a minute to realize how lucky they are to have the people that they love be with them and have the opportunity to spend time with them. And I think more people need to show that gratitude towards their family more often, because I don't think people do that.
And I think if you don't have enough time to spend with your spouse or your significant other or your partner, then do something that requires you to be together, like start a podcast.
Like start a podcast, right?
That's perfect. Yeah. I mean, it's just one of these things where, when I have a bad day or something like that, the thing that I fall back to is I go, no matter how bad this goes, no matter how much I fall on my face, at least I get to go home to my family and, they got my back. So it's pretty cool.
So doctor, how important is that, having that feeling, having that knowledge of your family and someone who's got your back and appreciation for them? How important is that on your overall health, do you think?
Oh, well, they've studied this, and, this is something that I think is very important in terms of just a sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-esteem. I mean, I would describe it as being very comparable as an adult to what you see in children, where if you don't have a secure family situation as a child, I think you can pretty much pick out who those kids are. They tend to act out. And, I think that's true as adults as well. So it's just sort of an adult version of a child thing. So
let's start to get into the gut a little bit, because I know that is one of your favorite topics to talk about. And we did talk about gut microbiome and your health with Dr. Chitty Parikh back on episode 204. So anybody who wants a little bit more of that back history, they can go back and listen to that one. But let's just give a quick review right now about what gut microbiome is. It's all over the place right now. Well, hopefully it's contained within you, but the words gut microbiome are all over the place right now. So let's just give the listeners an idea of what that is.
All right. So the Cliff Notes version here is that there was an explosion of science in the last 10 years where we really didn't know very much about these bacteria that live inside of us. And now today, 2017, we know there's 100 trillion bacteria. In the gut alone, there are hundreds, if not up to 15 or 1600 species. And so we're learning just how critical this is for the way that our body functions. It has implications from a metabolic perspective. It has an effect on our immune system. It affects the way that we process and absorb our food, which can determine whether or not we're thin, whether or not we're obese. It helps to protect us from cancer. I mean, basically, when you look at all of these issues that are occurring in the Western world these days, heart disease, cancer, all of these things track back to the gut. So the bottom line is that when you hear people say all health starts in the gut, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this population of bacteria that we've developed in a relationship with over millions of years, and it's important to us.
Do we have any control over it?
We do. We have a lot of control. I mean, some of it is inherited, some of it is genetic. But actually, there's a guy at the University of California, San Diego, and he's doing this really interesting project called the American Gut Project. And for less than $100, he will send you a kit, and you can fill out a questionnaire and send in a stool specimen. And they will basically compile that, look at your microbiome, and give you feedback about what's going on. So here's what's cool. Digestive Disease Week, which is the biggest GI meeting of the year, he stood up there. His name is Rob Knight. And he basically showed a graph looking at, okay, what are the things that predict a healthy gut? And this is not like him injecting his bias. This is just objective. What does the math say? And the answer to that question was, no surprise, it was the diversity of the plants that you eat. And so basically the single greatest predictor of a healthy gut was the consumption of a diverse mix of plant foods.
I just can't get out of my mind. I'm just stuck on this thought. You know what I want for my birthday?
I don't.
I want a stool sample analysis for my birthday this year.
God, I thought you were going to tell me you want a fecal implant or something.
No.
That is so much easier. That is honestly, that's a great request because it's less than $100. So, I mean, jewelry easily is more than $100. So.
Well, there's a Canadian exchange rate. So we're looking at a little bit more than that. But if you want, I could talk to your wife and put in a good word about one of those.
God.
But
you know what? My wife actually did it, believe it or not. So here's what's cool. So there's a website that you can go to. It's the letter U, biome.com. So ubiome.com. And you can do this again it's like $89. So here's what's interesting. My wife did this and she was taking a probiotic. She was taking actually a very reputable probiotic, and she did the ubiome test. And what was interesting is when she got her results back, it showed that the strains of bacteria in her probiotic basically were not registering in her microbiome. And so from my perspective, that when I looked at that, I said, this basically shows that your probiotic does not work. And that's one of the big concerns that I have when it comes to the modern use of probiotics, is that there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of people out there who are marketing and they want to sell you their product. But that doesn't mean that the thing that they're selling you is actually what you're going to get, or that it's going to make any difference in your gut.
So if she's taking that probiotic and I take that probiotic, is it possible that my body might absorb it, but her body might not? Or because we're both plant-based and eat really well and eat a large variety of foods, the probiotic's getting there and saying, I don't need to be here. There's no reason for me to be here. And I'm just going to go out the back door. Like, quite literally. Sorry, I love poop.
It's low hanging fruit and easy. So, all right. So the deal is, for the first question is, like, does the probiotic actually give you what they're claiming to give you? You know, after it sits on the shelf, after it gets transported in a truck, and who knows what temperature it was exposed to. And so when they've studied this question, third-party sort of consumer protection agencies, they find that, 35% or more of probiotics off the shelf just don't even have anything close to what they're claiming to have. So that's the first question. I mean, obviously, if it doesn't have anything close to what it's claiming to have, then it's not going to do any good for you or me or anyone else. But, I think your question is a good one, in the sense that we all have our own individual fingerprint of a microbiome, and, we can all consume plant foods, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have the same microbiome. It's always going to be different. So the effect of a probiotic on you certainly could be different than on someone else. And that is the next level that we have to get to, which is where we're actually personalizing our recommendations for probiotics, where we could potentially do a test, see what you have, see what your microbiome fingerprint looks like, and then basically tailor a probiotic specifically for you. And I think that would be super cool. I think it's going to come. It's just that maybe 5 or 10 years away.
So this is interesting stuff, but there's definitely a lot of people listening that know what a probiotic is. But for the few that may not know what a probiotic is, since we're talking about it, can you just explain what it does and what the purpose would be?
Right. So the definition of a probiotic is basically a bacterial strain or a bacteria that is clearly demonstrated in studies to have a health promoting effect. And so the concept here is that you're going to take, by mouth, some sort of either capsule or powder, whatever it may be, that contains these health promoting bacteria for the purpose of trying to improve your own personal health. Now, the issue that I come to is, I honestly think that, frankly, most physicians don't really understand probiotics, and they fall susceptible to what is marketed to them. Even, like, for example, not to call out this one probiotic, but like there's one that is made by the pharmaceutical companies, and it's incredible to me how weak this probiotic is. I mean, I just don't see where it can be beneficial to anyone. But they go into doctors' offices and they convince doctors that this is the one you got to use. And because they do that, the doctors don't know any better, and so that's what they do. When I recommend a probiotic, the one that I use in my office is one that has actual randomized controlled studies, where basically they'll give people, you either get the probiotic or you get a sugar pill, and they're going to look to see whether or not your irritable bowel syndrome or your ulcerative colitis improves. And so if you can do that, if you can show me that, randomized to a sugar pill or your probiotic, you actually are making a difference in people's disease, that to me is powerful. That means a lot.
So what is a prebiotic then? Let's explain that.
Sure. So prebiotic basically is the food that feeds the healthy bacteria that live inside of you. And so I like to compare it to a garden in the gut. So down here in South Carolina, if I plant a seed, which would be like taking a probiotic, if I plant a seed and I don't pour any water on that seed, it is just flat out not going to grow. It's like 100 degrees every day down here. But on the flip side, if you plant that seed and then at the same time you're pouring water over that seed and you nourish it, then you're going to get the maximum effect out of that seed. Next thing you know, you're going to have a beautiful flower or a tomato bush or whatever it may be. And so prebiotics and probiotics go hand in hand. You can't do probiotics and consume an inadequate amount of prebiotics. The prebiotic is the food that those bacteria need to eat. So what is that food? Well, it's fiber. It's not that complicated. It's fiber. Where do we find fiber? It's in plants. And what happens when you consume fiber is an absolutely fascinating and I think wildly underrated thing. So, I as a physician, like completely medically trained. I trained at Northwestern and University of North Carolina, like these top institutions. But if you asked me, 3-4 years ago, like what happens with fiber when you eat it, I would say it passes through the body and comes out the other end. And that's actually not true. The soluble fiber, and to a lesser degree, the insoluble fiber, but the soluble fiber, the stuff that it dissolves in water, it gets transformed by the gut bacteria. And so it goes from fiber into something called a short chain fatty acid. So you may have heard of butyrate. And so butyrate is this transformation product. And these short chain fatty acids have incredible effects on the body. I mean, if you get into this, you're going to look at this list of health benefits and you're going to say, this is something that clearly we all need. And so it affects the immune system. It prevents cancer. It regulates blood sugars. It regulates cholesterol. And so it's incredible. It's powerful stuff. And in the United States, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't expect it to be substantially different up in your neck of the woods. I think that we're just wildly fiber deficient. And when I look at the issues that are here, obesity, autoimmune disease, cancer, I don't think it's simple enough to just pin it on one thing. But I would say that the fiber deficiency is a huge problem. And so let me give you an example of how bad it is. The average woman in the United States, when they've studied this, consumes 18 grams of fiber per day. And the USDA recommends that we consume anywhere from 25 to 35 grams of fiber. Now, I say it kind of like that, like I shrug my shoulders when I say that because that's nothing. Like I think that 25 to 35 grams per day is literally half of what our minimum amount should be. And if you go and you study cultures in Africa that are still living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the way that we lived as human beings for millions of years before we organized, into civilizations, these people are consuming 150 grams of fiber per day. So for millions of years, that's what we did, 150 grams of fiber per day. And now we're doing 10% of that. I think that this has to be the lowest number of any culture in human history. And here we are, suffering the consequences from a health perspective.
We're definitely fiber deficient. We know that.
Not us.
Not us, but most of North America is fiber deficient. I mean, we hear the question all the time, like, where do you get your protein from? And you've heard the argument, where do you get your fiber from, to the people that aren't eating plants enough, because they're fiber deficient. But my question is, if the prebiotic coming from plants is what's fueling the probiotic, and people generally in North America are not consuming fiber, not eating enough plants, would taking in fiber artificially through supplements be any use to the probiotic at all?
Yeah, so let's start with this. I mean, I know you guys would agree with me on this, that in a perfect world, it should be coming from plant foods.
Absolutely.
In a perfect world, we should be consuming a diversity of plant foods. It goes back to what we were just talking about a couple minutes ago with Rob Knight at University of California, San Diego. Diversity of plant foods is the single greatest predictor of gut health. And this is probably the reason why. Diversity of fiber. But is there value to taking a supplement for the purpose of bumping up your fiber level? I think that there is. I mean, let me put it this way. I'm a plant-based gastroenterologist, and I have 5 prebiotic supplements in my house that I rotate and consume on a regular basis. And, my thing is, here's what I do now. I wake up every single morning and I kind of have this philosophy, like, we get dehydrated at night. We have dinner and then you go to bed and you might be up to the restroom a few times. And then you wake up in the morning and pound coffee and you just dehydrate yourself even further. And so what I've started doing is I wake up in the morning, I have a monstrous glass of water and I mix in one of my prebiotic supplements with it. And I found that since I started doing that, I feel so much better. I still drink coffee, but I feel so much better when I do that before my coffee. Rehydrate, turn on the kidneys, turn on the gut, turn on the brain, feed my microbiome, and then my day's off to a good start.
When I start with a new client, I try to start very small. So it's, what's the one thing we're doing this week? What's the 2 things we're doing new on the second week? And then we go three in from there. And it's always start the day with water. Because exactly, we're sweating through the night, we're fasting, and when we kickstart our body with coffee, we think that we're kickstarting our body, we're kickstarting our mind, we're going to be ready for it. But really, that's really acidic for us, especially people who suffer from IBS or Crohn's or any kind of disease in that area. And just getting that water and getting your body functioning to be able to then deal with more acidic foods or foods that we should be eating, fibrous foods, non-fibrous foods, what have you. Yeah, that water in the morning is, I go through, you could see right now the size of this cup. It's about the size of my head. And I go through about 2 of those in the morning before anything else enters my mouth. And the next thing is usually just organic green tea.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, it's incredibly simple and it's basically free. So why are we not all doing that, you know?
I've heard you say before that we consume about 80,000 pounds of food in our lifetime. So how important is all of that food that we eat on our overall health, and how is it affecting our gut as we go? That
is such an awesome, hilarious question to me, because when I bring that up in all seriousness, like, you know, how is it that medical doctors can be so smart and yet not see that the 1,000 pounds of food per year, the 80,000 pounds of food during your lifetime is way more important than the couple milligrams of medicine that they're prescribing? I mean, it blows my mind. And so there is no question that the food that you eat is a determinant of your health. In fact, I would make an argument that that is the single greatest determinant of health during your lifetime. And here's why. Most of your genetics are not things that you are predetermined to develop. There are things that you are predisposed to developing. So, I mean, there's exceptions. You know, for example, if you take Down syndrome, we can test for Down syndrome. And if you have the genetics for Down syndrome, you're going to have Down syndrome. That is what it is. But the vast majority of things, the reason why genetic tests haven't panned out the way that we were all hoping that they would from a medical perspective, is that if you have the gene, that doesn't mean that you're going to develop the disease. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about celiac disease. So celiac disease totally exploding. Like, go look at any graph and it is an arrow pointing straight up. And the thing about celiac disease is that 30 to 40% of us carry the genes for it. 1% of us right now actually develop the disease. So what is the thing that determines who develops celiac disease? And here's what's kind of cool. It's actually someone up in your neck of the woods in Toronto. Her name is Elena Verdu, and she's at McMaster. And she actually has done studies in the last couple of years to demonstrate and basically answer this question for us, which is that there are 3 things that you need to develop celiac disease. Exposure to gluten, which is every single person in North America. The genetics, which 30 to 40% of us have. And alterations in the gut microbiome. And the word that we use for alterations in the gut microbiome is a generic term right now. It's called dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is just a catch-all term, which means a bad change. But give it 5 years or 10 years, and Elena Verdu is going to tell us exactly what that change is in the microbiome so that we can predict who will or will not develop celiac disease based upon looking at the gut. Just like when they take the microbiome from children at the age of 6 months, they can now predict who's going to develop asthma later in life.
That's so interesting. I always explain genetics and whether or not we're actually going to make that a reality, kind of like a light switch. That light switch is in the room and you could walk in and out of the room and choose to turn the light on and off. And our lifestyle, starting with the foods that we eat, the stress that we have in our life, the way that we choose to use or not use other drugs and alcohol, is what helps to determine whether that light is going to be turned on and off, or if it's going to be on a dimmer somewhere in between. And we could keep that light from going on a lot longer, a lot later on in our life, or keep it from never going on completely and just keep it on the dimmer. And of course, some people are just going to, be in that situation no matter what. But if we could do everything that we can to never get into that situation, then why wouldn't we? And that's kind of how I look at genetics in terms of that light switch and the dimmer.
I think that's a totally appropriate analogy. And, one of the things that I think is really kind of cool about what we're learning from a scientific perspective is that if you really boil it down, it's validating what grandma always told me. So, grandma told me you got to eat your fruits and vegetables, and it turns out that she's right. And, when you see, like, I have a background in research. I was on a grant from the NIH, the National Institute of Health, published more than 20 papers. And so for me, when I analyze research, I like to see that there's different layers that are all pointing in the exact same direction. So what I mean by that is it's really cool when you have animal-based studies, population-based studies, different levels that are all saying the exact same thing. So I think about the Blue Zones. And so the Blue Zones was a book that basically said, okay, there's these 5 communities totally separate around the world. And these people are living to be 100 years old. They don't have autoimmune disease. They don't have cancer. They don't really have access to healthcare like we have, but they don't need it. And their diet ties them all together. And so what is the backbone of their diet? Well, it's actually a complete 180 reversal from the way that we eat in North America, which is that they are at least 90% plant-based, if not more. I mean, if you look, there's only one blue zone in North America, and that's Loma Linda, California, and that's because it's where the Seventh-day Adventists are. And so it's just so interesting and fascinating to me that, okay, here's this Blue Zone book talking about 2017, these 5 populations of people that are living to be 100 years old. And what it's saying is eat more plants. And at the same time, here's this science about the microbiome that's exploding. And it's saying to me, eat more plants. It's all lining up to point in the exact same direction.
There's a lot of questions going around, like if we can get everything that we can out of food, why should we take supplements like probiotics? So there's a lot of comparison of probiotics and fermented foods out there. And I know that you like talking about fermented foods, and I'd love to talk about it more. So is there a difference between eating fermented foods and taking a probiotic, or can one replace the other?
There's no question that there's a difference, and they may be complementary. And so let me break this down. A good probiotic is going to be only a couple of strains. Like the one that I prescribe in my clinic is 8 strains of bacteria, and it's going to be in a very, very high dose, hopefully. I mean, basically the studies show us that if it's going to work, it needs to be in a high dose. So if you have a probiotic that's 2 billion or 5 billion, I hate to break it to you, but you're probably wasting your money, to be honest with you. The probiotics that I prescribe for people that are totally healthy, they take a capsule that has 112 billion bacteria in it. And when my patients have irritable bowel syndrome, I start off at 225 billion bacteria, and I work my way towards 450. That's a fraction of what I use in my patients who have ulcerative colitis, where it could be 900 billion or even 1.8 trillion bacteria per day. It's like crazy numbers. It's insane. So the probiotic is only delivering those couple of strains. And these are strains that are not designed to actually integrate into your microbiome. So what that means is if you were to stop it, you're going to go back to whatever you had, whatever your diet dictates, within 2 weeks. What it does do, though, is it changes the balance of bacteria. So basically, it puts the good guys in position to win in your gut. So it's kind of like sending in the cavalry, like you're sending in the reinforcements, and you're sort of changing the balance in sort of that battle between the good guys and the bad guys in your gut. On the flip side, fermented foods are going to offer to you many different strains of bacteria. So let me give you an example. I love sauerkraut. Now, I don't think that, it's kind of like, I think about eating fermented foods as very similar to eating plant foods. You wouldn't just eat kale your entire life. You wouldn't just eat broccoli sprouts and nothing else. Like those might be the healthiest foods that exist, but you need that diversity. Well, the same is true with fermented foods. Like don't just pick out one and just hammer it all day long. I think that diversity, mixing in different ones is important. But that being said, let's look at sauerkraut. When I make my own sauerkraut, which, by the way, the first time I did it, my wife thought I was totally nuts. Totally nuts. Because I chopped up this cabbage and put it into a jar, and I slapped it on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks, and it just like sat there.
It got moldy.
And no, it's not moldy. It's phenomenal.
Oh.
It's incredible. So after 3 weeks, I crack open this jar and I jammed a fork into it. My wife thought, like literally, she thought that I was going to start frothing at the mouth and probably poop my pants. And so, but that's the beauty of fermentation. And I'd love to talk more about that process that the food goes through. But first, let me just answer your question, which is to say that mature sauerkraut, when they've studied it, shows 680 species of bacteria. So you talk about trying to repopulate the gut with the types of bacteria that you need. When I talk about dysbiosis, like we were just talking about with celiac disease, this is the same concept. Dysbiosis, this is the same concept that applies to irritable bowel syndrome, to ulcerative colitis, and to things even far outside of the gut. Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, autism, ADD, all these modern epidemics have all been associated with changes in gut bacteria, which we are calling dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is a loss of diversity. If you go to the Amazon rainforest and you find these populations that have never been exposed to Coca-Cola Classic, or if you go to Africa and they've never had, McDonald's cheeseburger. Basically, what you're going to find is those populations have 15 or 1,600 species of bacteria. We in North America are rocking 300 to 1,000. So right there, we're operating without hundreds of species of bacteria that we evolved to have over millions of years. And they were there for a reason, and we let them go extinct. So just like animals that go extinct in our planet and the consequences that happen where you change that ecosystem, the same is true with the ecosystem inside of us, the gut. You lose these species, and where are you going to get them from? We've hyper-sterilized our environment. And, how did we get to this place? How did we get to this place where the gut is such a problem? Well, let me tell you my theory on that. I think it started with Louis Pasteur. He's a good guy. I don't hold it against him. But basically, Louis Pasteur studied fermentation. And ironically, by studying fermentation, he realized, oh my gosh, bacteria are the cause of disease. Because if you go back, it wasn't that long ago. This was less than 200 years ago. They didn't know what caused the plague. They thought it was this thing called miasma, which is like a borderline supernatural thing. Google a picture of miasma sometime, M-I-A-S-M-A.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, it's like a skeleton floating through the air. And so the best that I can explain it of what they were thinking back then, we're talking like 1850s, is that if you walk by a swamp at night, it's dark out, there's that creepy mist, and there's a funky smell. That's what they thought caused the plague before Louis Pasteur comes around and goes, y'all are crazy. What are you talking about? So he identifies that bacteria are the cause of disease. Well, in 1900, what was killing people? Pneumonia, tuberculosis, influenza. Basically, it was infections that were killing people. And so we started to innovate to address this issue that we had. And we innovated to first add chlorine to our water. And then we developed antibiotics around World War II. And I'm not saying that antibiotics are a bad thing. We added 15 years to our life expectancy instantly when we invented antibiotics. But clearly we have overutilized antibiotics. And so antibiotics in the cows, 80% of the antibiotic use in the United States is going to livestock that people turn around and eat. I personally find it to be disgusting, but beyond that, you are wasting our antibiotics so that people who sell those products can make more money. And it's scary to imagine a world where those antibiotics stop working.
And yeah, we're sterilizing our body and we're creating resistance. I know growing up, I had an ear infection every week. Every 10 days, the ear infection would be gone, but then it would be back. And I spent so many years on amoxicillin that it stopped working. And then I had to move to something stronger. Right. And mix that with the cow milk that I was drinking, not a good scenario.
So let me give you an example of what happens when you take antibiotics. Because the funny thing is, I never in a million years thought that I would be this guy. But I've turned into the antibiotic steward in the hospital. I roll around the hospital and I'm discontinuing antibiotics on everyone. So basically what happens is let's talk about Cipro because we have clear-cut data on that. Cipro is frequently used for urinary tract infections, often for 7 days, 14 days. If you look at it for just 5 days, 5 days of Cipro wipes out 35% of the bacteria in your gut. That's a scary thing because you lost a third of your gut bacteria, and our studies show us that it's going to take 1 or 2 years for you to achieve a proper balance from that 5 days of Cipro that you just took.
Even if you're taking a probiotic to counteract?
I would argue that if you were to take a probiotic and, to me, even more importantly, a prebiotic or consuming the proper diet, that's really the most important thing. I think it would be faster. I think that you can expedite that process. What exactly that means, we don't have good data on because it would depend on what probiotic you're taking, and they haven't looked at that with the proper probiotics. So, but your gut won't achieve that balance for 1 or 2 years. And here's the other part that's scary is that, so you wiped out 35%, what's left behind? The 65% that's left behind are the bacteria that are Cipro resistant. And now you've basically created this opportunity for these bacteria to move into this space and start to become more dominant. And so these bacteria take a more powerful place in your gut going forward. And so I am alarmed by the changes that occur with antibiotics, and I am extremely cautious about prescribing them. Look, sometimes you need them. If you need them, you need them, and then I would encourage
save lives, right?
Yeah, no question. But you should not be taking, an antibiotic because, well, what if, or it's possible, or let's be definitive about what the indications are, and let's take the least amount necessary to achieve the effect that we're going for.
Right. But we should be taking a probiotic?
With the antibiotic?
Just in general, because you mentioned before, a healthy person, you're still giving them a probiotic.
If they're taking, sure. So to answer your question,
because I asked because like the only supplements that I would take right now, I would say that when the sun's not around, I'm taking my vitamin D. I'm also taking my B12 because I know I can't get that through the food that I consume. But that's it, right? I don't do, generally, I think I'm pretty healthy now, and I don't do probiotic, but I think I heard you say that even when you're healthy, we should be doing that.
Okay, so, there's so much I want to say about what you just said, because
we're gonna have to do
really good.
Part 2 just on fermented foods.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, let me just toss this out there just real quick. I totally agree with you. I think that taking supplements are like taking medications. They have side effects too. Actually, one of the alarming things is they're not regulated, and so many times you don't even know what you're taking. I want to come back to vitamin D in a moment, but first let me answer your question, which is this. Every society in human history prior to us consumed fermented foods. They had a way to introduce healthy bacteria back into the gut. If we go back to that sauerkraut on the counter for 3 weeks, 680 different species of bacteria, what's in there? That includes actually many of the species of bacteria that are known to have a probiotic effect. For example, Lactobacillus plantarum. Find any reputable probiotic, it's going to find Lactobacillus plantarum. The dominant bacteria in mature sauerkraut is Lactobacillus plantarum. So you are getting these probiotic bacteria in your sauerkraut.
I'm just trying to find someone to say that 10 times fast.
Yeah, so every culture in human history consumed these fermented foods because we had to. And then we decided to flip the switch and go into, okay, we're going to can our food. We're going to invent, if you look at how many preservatives there are, it's extremely alarming. There are 5,000 to 6,000 preservatives, and very few of them have had any human testing to demonstrate safety, all developed in the last 100 years. So, basically we come to this place now, here we are, and it's the 20th century, and we are dropping the one thing that reintroduces healthy bacteria into our gut, and we're replacing it with thousands of different chemicals that we have no clue what they do. And so the point from my perspective, to answer your question about should a healthy person take a probiotic, I think a healthy person should consume fermented food.
Right.
But I think that a healthy person needs a way to reintroduce healthy bacteria into the system to maintain that balance. Because the problem is, once you cross that line into having disease, if you develop ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease or any of these other things that are associated with alterations in gut bacteria, you can't just walk right back. Mm-hmm. It's not like you can take a probiotic and some fiber and then get back to being a healthy person again. You're stuck. And so the point from my perspective is, in health, you want to keep it that way. And that's where it's attention to these things that are known to promote a benefit in the gut. So can I comment on vitamin D real quick? Because I
sure.
love the too.
Of course.
There's this really cool dude who lives in Charleston that I got to have dinner with. His name is Bruce Hollis. He has done these massive studies with vitamin D, great studies funded by the NIH, multi-center studies. And so we're hanging out and having dinner, and we're talking about vitamin D. And here's what I learned from him. Vitamin D is actually probably misnamed as a vitamin. It's better to think about it as a hormone. And it makes complete sense, because we are, maybe not the first generation, but we are one of the first generations in human history to move indoors, to not spend an adequate amount of time outside getting that daily dose of vitamin D. And so you will see many doctors who prescribe vitamin D based upon blood levels. You also see many doctors who prescribe vitamin D at a super high dose once a week. And the answer is, we need to treat this like a hormone, which means we need that daily release. So just like you, I take vitamin D every day. I take it as a supplement. Now I try to get outside. I do my best, but obviously I'm working during the key hours where vitamin D is available. And for you guys up in Toronto, I mean, let's just be honest, there's not a lot of time during the day where you're actually getting the right UV rays.
And I think if you're outside in, a pair of pants and a t-shirt to your elbows, that you're not exposed enough to really be absorbing enough anyway.
That's totally right. And it also depends on the time of day. So like you guys are at this point, being mid-September, you're starting to enter into this time of year where you have a very, very limited window of time during your day up in Toronto to actually get UV rays. And so I actually believe that we should all be taking vitamin D, and the dose is substantially more than what other people recommend. So talking to Bruce Hollis, there are no studies that show that taking 10,000 units a day or less can be harmful.
Wow.
And the amount that you get when you expose yourself to the sun is substantially more than that. And so I personally take 5,000 units per day, but here's something interesting. I mean, this is just an anecdote, so this is not like by itself a study, but he was telling me about how he knew people who had metastatic prostate cancer and they took high dose vitamin D. And as you guys know, vitamin D activates the immune system, very closely tied to the immune system. And so with an active immune system, you can fight cancer. And so Bruce told me stories about these people he knew with metastatic prostate cancer taking 20,000 units of vitamin D per day. Now, for the people listening at home, like I'm not telling you to go take 20,000 units of vitamin D a day, but this is what they did. And actually the cancer regressed, like to the shock of all of their Western trained doctors. Mm-hmm. So my wife has an uncle who has metastatic prostate cancer. So after we met with Bruce Hollis, we told him, you need to start taking high dose vitamin D. And we told him to take 10,000 units a day. He did. And I'm just tossing this out there. His PSA is undetectable, which is the lab that we use to measure the extent of the prostate cancer. Mm-hmm. So I think vitamin D is a fascinating topic. I think it's another one of the things that's a consequence of modern living is that we're kind of dropping the ball on that. And I think we should all be taking it every day. So I'm with you there, and I'm with you on the B12 for sure too.
Crazy stuff. So let's get back to the fermentation because I know people want to hear about this. You talked about the sauerkraut. First of all, how do you ferment this cabbage to turn it into sauerkraut? And then I want you to tell us what other foods we could be eating that are fermented that are going to give us these benefits.
But I also want to know what's actually happening during that fermentation process.
Yeah.
Even though I just slurred all those words.
Yeah.
Sorry. I also want to know what.
You had too much kombucha, didn't you?
Oh God, I had
that's
one yesterday.
That's another topic.
Oh my
we'll
God,
talk about
I'm
in a second.
so affected by the alcohol in kombucha.
Well, I want to talk about that in a minute.
All right, cool. So here's the deal. This is something that I think is super interesting because I don't know, it's like borderline magic to me. If you take plant foods, they pre-exist in their natural state with the bacteria that you need to ferment them. So you don't need to go and buy a probiotic or a starter culture or anything like that if you're fermenting a plant. And any plant that exists, it's possible to ferment. It's just that certain things do better than others. Like fibrous foods do much better with fermentation than things that lack fiber. Like if it's soft, it's not going to do very well when you ferment it. So when you take that cabbage, using sauerkraut as an example, and you take that cabbage, basically, let me first walk you through how I make it. Get that head of organic cabbage, and I do a minimal rinse on it. I am really not like scrubbing it or trying to clean it aggressively. And I'll peel off the top couple of layers of leaves. And then I just take that and I chop it up to whatever size I like my sauerkraut to be. So like I like crunchy kraut, and so I cut it a little bit thick and chop it up, and I kind of work my hands into it, and I knead it to kind of get the juices from inside the cabbage to start to express. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You'll hear other people say a different approach. I'll just tell you what I do. I pack it into a mason jar. I have a thing called a pickle packer, which is kind of a funny name.
We're pickle makers, so we got it.
Yeah. Okay, so I take my pickle packer, which is basically like a wooden utensil, and it allows me to mash on the cabbage. So I'll put this into the mason jar, I'll put some garlic in there, and I mash it down to pack it in. And then on top of it, I put a glass disc called a pickle pebble. It's a fermentation weight, and it's just intended to basically keep the cabbage underwater. And you cover it with a sea salt brine. So basically, it needs to be sea salt because if it's table salt, which contains iodine kills. Like in the operating room, when they clean up someone before they're going to perform surgery, they use iodine swabs. Iodine kills bacteria. So you need non-iodized salt, and I use sea salt. And then water, I mean, naturally, you want clean water. Like the water out of your tap has chlorine in it. Chlorine kills bacteria. This is one of my concerns about modern living. What happens when you drink chlorinated water and it goes down into your gut? This is the reason why my wife and I, we saved for like a year to get it, but we have a reverse osmosis filter so that we can purify our water. So you want clean, pure water. If you need pure water, honestly, all you need to do is boil it and then let it sit for a couple hours and return to room temperature. So water, sea salt, make that brine. You can taste the brine. If it tastes way too salty, add a little more water. If you're not really feeling the salt there, then you probably need a little more salt. You can make sauerkraut without salt. It's just that salt actually makes it taste better. So you make your sea salt brine and you got your cabbage in your mason jar and you pour it over the top and you cover it up. You cover everything. You cover the pickle pebble and then you cover it. And once a day, you should crack open the jar and just burp it, let any gas out, because basically it's going to, after a day or two, you're going to see bubbles. And so it's going to start producing gas. So now what happens? The cabbage is submerged underwater. And what's cool about that is, let's go back to the gut. And the reason that 10 years ago, we only knew of 200 species in the gut, that's because we could only culture them. That's the only laboratory technique that we had. So we could only identify, 2006, we could only identify the bacteria that we were able to culture. But it turns out that 99% of the bacteria in the gut are something called anaerobic, which means that if you expose them to air, they die. And so these anaerobic bacteria are the exact same ones that thrive in an environment underwater because there's no air in there. And so you submerge this cabbage and you are basically creating an environment to allow the anaerobic bacteria, the exact same ones that are in your gut, to thrive, to multiply. And they start to do that. And you'll start to see the gas that's produced as they start to transform your food. And it takes about 7 days for your food. When you're doing sauerkraut, it takes about 7 days for it to go from salty cabbage to actually tasting like sauerkraut, that flavor that y'all know, which is, it's complex and it's vibrant and it's sour. Why is it sour? It's sour because basically these bacteria, we call them lactic acid bacteria, they produce that healthy acid. It's a good acid. And basically that acid helps to create an environment that allows them to flourish even more. And the longer that it goes, the reason why I wait 3 weeks as opposed to eating it all after 1 week is because it's like wine. Wine gets better with age because of fermentation. So does sauerkraut.
Is there any concern as to the bacteria that's growing in it, and if there's actually dirty bacteria that can hinder our health as opposed to promote health when we make it at home? Because it's not, I know it's not a sterile food, but it's also not a sterile environment.
Right. And so that's the thing that's funny about this is our generation has been raised and trained to think in a way that bacteria are our enemy. And we need to actually change the way we look at bacteria and start embracing them as our friend, because that's the relationship that we have with these microbes, with what's in our gut. And so these bacteria in your sauerkraut, let me put it this way. There are literally 0 reports of food poisoning from people making sauerkraut. Literally 0. Now, you have to use your head. Like, if you look at your sauerkraut and there's a mold on the top, you're not going to eat that. Like, please throw that out. Right. But if it smells funny, if it doesn't smell right to you, then throw it out. But you know what sauerkraut smells like, you know what sauerkraut tastes like, and you're going to find that, the vast majority of the time, you're going to get to that place where this is incredible stuff and it's good for you, and you don't need to worry about that, because basically what happens, which by the way is the exact same thing that happens inside of us, is when the good bacteria start to multiply, they dominate and they take over. And this is the reason why I'm so opposed to antibiotics and so in favor of prebiotics and probiotics, is that in our gut, like, we're not going to win the battle by prescribing antibiotics time after time after time. We're going to win by basically empowering the good guys and trying to make them multiply and grow.
If we go to the store and buy sauerkraut, especially in a organic store or health food store, is it necessarily fermented properly? Or are there sterile sauerkraut that's being sold? You
got to look at the jar. Like the stuff that I grew up eating, back when I was a kid and we would crack open a can and slap it on a hot dog. That's not what I'm talking about. And so basically that stuff, it's vinegar based. And that is a 20th century industrial food shortcut to try to recreate the same flavor as sauerkraut. So they take cabbage and they basically pour vinegar on it and they pickle it. It's not the same as taking cabbage and submerging it in brine and allowing the healthy bacteria to transform it and create its own acid content, as opposed to you introducing the acid with the vinegar.
Do you need to make sure that when you're filling that jar with the brine that it's filled right to the top so that it doesn't get moldy? Like, what are the tricks to making sure that you're not wasting your energy and organic cabbage?
Okay, so there's a couple elements, and first let me throw this out there. There is a book that I strongly recommend that people read if they want to get into fermentation. I think that everyone should get this book. It's a James Beard Award-winning book, and I have never been let down by the James Beard Award. Like, anytime I go to a James Beard Award-winning restaurant, I'm always like, yeah, I get it. They deserve it. So anyway, the book is called The Art of Fermentation, and it's by this guy named Sandor Katz, K-A-T-Z. And so he is someone who started doing this decades ago, basically as a way to try to improve his health and to combat HIV. And he, now it turns out that because of the gut health epidemic that we have, he's becoming, increasingly popular because people are turning to fermented food and saying, I think that we probably need this. I think we probably need this back. So I would recommend that anyone read that. So to answer your question, though, about like what are the things that we can control to have good sauerkraut, temperature is really important. So like this time of year is a great time to start doing this, because if you put it outside, if it's the ideal temperature, frankly, is less than 70 degrees for sauerkraut. And so if it's cool nights, you can put it outside, and there really isn't such a thing as too cold as long as it's not freezing. But basically the speed with which your kraut ferments is going to be inversely proportional to temperature. The hotter that it is, the faster it's going to ferment, and the more likely it is to kind of spin out of control. The cooler that it is, the slower and more meticulous of a process it's going to be, and the more likely you are to be successful in doing it. So temperature is a really big thing. Salt content is a big thing. The more salt that you add, the more likely you are to be successful, but don't add so much that you're not going to like the flavor. That's where I recommend that you taste the brine. And, in terms of water content, it's not so much the water as much as it is exposure to air. So you can't expose there's a reason why you put a cap on the sauerkraut on the mason jar, which is that you don't want it being exposed to air, because that creates opportunity for mold and stuff to come along.
I want to ask a question that's more of a disclaimer, but if you are a heart patient, do you have to be careful with this kind of food because it's so high in salt?
Yeah, well, so, you can, if you're doing it yourself, you control the salt content. You actually don't need salt to make sauerkraut. It just gives you better control over the fermentation process and makes it less likely to, get messed up. So, you could totally make sauerkraut, if you got nice cool weather, you could totally make it without any salt. It just tastes a little bit better with at least a little salt.
So other than sauerkraut, what are some other good fermented foods that people should be thinking about consuming?
Well, first of all, going back to the concept that plants are innately created with the bacteria that we need already on them, you can ferment any plant. And so like the other day, this was actually really fun. So the other day I had a pineapple on my counter, and I was like, that would be really fun to ferment a pineapple. And it makes a lot of sense because it's a fibrous food. And so, like I said before, fibrous things ferment a lot better. So basically, I looked up a recipe, and it turns out that there's a Mexican pineapple soda that is completely fermented. I chopped up the pineapple. I tossed in some cinnamon and some cloves, and conceptually the same as the sauerkraut, except instead of salt, I actually used sugar water. And so I used a nice organic clean sugar and put it all into a gallon jug, and I left it for about a week, and it transforms from pineapple into this tart pineapple soda called Tepache, Tepache. It's so easy to make. And so once you get it to the place where it's pretty much ready to go, you can throw it into a flip top bottle, close the bottle, and let it sit on your counter for another 1 or 2 days, and it'll become carbonated. And then you can crack it open and drink it just like soda. Like, it's carbonated, it's got the fizz and everything. So that's an example of something, but the more mainstream stuff is kombucha. So kombucha, for the listeners out there who haven't tried this before, I mean, this is sort of a growing,
It's huge. It's everywhere.
a growingly popular beverage. Yeah. But 20 years ago, no one knew what this was, which is why this guy GT from GT's Kombucha, I mean, this guy is like a bazillionaire now because he was the first one to start doing this just 20 years ago.
Should have bought shares.
Kombucha is fermented tea. I mean, it's just fermented sweet tea. You make sweet tea the way that people make it down here in the South, but then you add in, because sweet tea obviously does not have the bacteria already on board like a plant does, you have to add in the bacteria. And so to make kombucha, you take sweet tea and you add in something called a SCOBY, which stands for symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. And it's this gelatinous disc that I think looks like an alien, but some people say it looks like a mushroom. You add that and 2 cups of kombucha to the sweet tea and put it into a gallon jug and basically just let it hang out on your counter. That's an example of something where it needs to be exposed to air. So you're not going to cover that up. But, kombucha, it's a very intimidating thing to make. But once you sort of go for it and you do it, you'll find actually it's not that complicated. And I find it to be a ton of fun, and it saves you a lot of money because a bottle of kombucha at the store is at least $3, and I can make a gallon of kombucha that tastes better and has whatever flavors I like. Like I'll do raspberry mint, strawberry basil. I'm looking at my counter right now, and I got a pear kombucha, and I got a cocoa and maca powder kombucha.
A colleague of mine today actually said that when she drinks kombucha, because that's what she pronounces it as, she gets this buzz, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like she's drinking alcohol. And I noticed on one of the bottles that she had, it said contains small amounts of alcohol. Is the alcohol a byproduct of the fermenting process, or is that something else?
It is. There's 3 major products of the fermentation process. So people get worried about the sugar in kombucha, but the sugar gets consumed by the bacteria. And the 3 things that get produced are, you get some alcohol, you get a number of different healthy acids, like lactic acid is one of them, but there's several other ones, acetic acid, and then you get antioxidant polyphenols. And so you are taking your sugar, something that is not really not really healthy for you, and you're transforming it into things that are healthy for you. The alcohol content, if you buy it at the store, they regulate it, and it's required to be less than 0.5%, which is the reason why people don't get carded to buy kombucha. But if you make it at home, depending on when you choose to consume it, it could have up to 3%, which is, that's pretty close to a Coors Light. So there is alcohol content that exists in homemade kombucha.
So what about somebody who's an alcoholic? Would they be smart to stay away from kombucha altogether?
I would definitely. If someone has alcoholism, our studies show us, I take care of liver patients. That's part of what I do as a gastroenterologist. And alcoholism is a real and scary disease, and your brain chemistry does not change for decades. And so the last thing that you need is to put yourself in any position for a possible relapse. So without question, history of alcohol abuse, alcoholism, I would definitely avoid consuming kombucha.
What about kids?
I don't see that as a very big deal with kids. You don't want them to be drinking this in extremely high volumes. Frankly, I don't think that any of us should be drinking, multiple bottles of kombucha per day. I think it's reasonable, though, for kids to take a sip here and there. I've given it to my daughter, and she's not a huge fan, but maybe someday.
And what about pregnant women?
That's a tough question because, pregnant women, I actually think that fermented foods could be beneficial to pregnant women. There is no question that there are changes in the microbiome during pregnancy, and they have downstream implications on the child later in life. And so I actually think that fermented food during pregnancy is reasonable as long as you're being very cautious about it. The alcohol content is quite low in kombucha, so I'm not so concerned about the alcohol content and risk of any fetal alcohol, things like that. That being said, I'm sure you can hear a little bit of reservation in my voice, and the reason why I'm just a little bit hesitant to completely endorse it is that there is a recommendation in a breastfeeding book, a manual, that basically says we should not consume kombucha if breastfeeding. Now, there really is not great science to back that up. Frankly, we need science to answer one way or another what the deal is. But as it currently stands, I can't recommend kombucha consumption during breastfeeding just because of that. And I would encourage people who are pregnant just to be very cautious with it.
I know Adam's aunt works for CAMH, which is one of the biggest mental health research hospitals down here. I know that she goes all over Canada and lectures about alcohol in children and women, pregnant women and breastfeeding women. And I know that lots of doctors do say, a glass of wine a day, not a problem. But based on what I've heard her talk about, there was no alcohol consumption during any days that I knew I was pregnant. But of course, it's for everybody to make their own decision. But I think knowing that there can be traces of alcohol in the kombucha, then we can make our decisions from there. Would there be traces of alcohol in other fermented foods as well?
There are in some, basically you're going to find alcohol if there's fermentation of a sugar, whereas if it's fermentation of fiber, just plant fiber, then you're not going to have alcohol. So for example, the sauerkraut is not going to contain alcohol, but the kombucha or my tepache that I was talking about, the fermented pineapple drink, I would expect that contains alcohol as well.
And like something like miso wouldn't, because that's just the soybean.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. B, you're like, I'm talking to an encyclopedia here. Like there's, it's like.
I want to keep going.
The conversation, this is way longer than most of our episodes, and we're just going and going. And it's just, it's fascinating. Like there's so much more we could be talking about. If people want to reach out and connect with you or find out more information from you, where would you want them to go?
So about a year ago, I started this Instagram account called HappyGutMD. And it's, I'm here today talking to you guys with this super successful podcast because of the way that my Instagram has grown in this past year. And so that's where I would encourage people to go, is find me on Instagram, HappyGutMD. And also we can, if you guys want to post the link to my webpage, which at this point is my I'm a fully practicing gastroenterologist right now, full time. That's my webpage right now, but I am in the process of developing also something that's more suitable for this message that I'm trying to put out there.
Cool. Well, definitely we're going to link to your Instagram, to your website. And anything else you want us to, you'll just let us know. We'll make sure to link to it. We really appreciate you spending this time with us. I've learned a ton.
This was so interesting for me, and our listeners know that I love poop. So anything
Nice.
poop, especially the ones in the Healthy Plant-Based Families Facebook group, whenever a poop question comes up, I get all excited. It's like I had 10 kombuchas.
We didn't even talk about fecal transplant.
I know.
Missing out.
Well, we'll get there again next time. And once we get off the air, I'm going to ask you which company Adam should go to for my birthday present this year.
Nice.
But thank you so much. We really appreciate the time that you've given us and our listeners and taking the time out from your beautiful family and for all the work that you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for promoting a message of health by eating plants.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Plant Trainers Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or any other podcast listening platforms. We appreciate the feedback we receive from you. Every time we get a 5-star rating or review on iTunes from one of our fans, it ensures other people will find us too. Thanks to our patrons. To become a patron, visit www.patreon.com/planttrainers. Even supporting us with $1 really makes a difference. Connect and follow us on Instagram and Twitter @PlantTrainers. Like Plant Trainers on Facebook, join our newsletter, and check out our website at www.planttrainers.com for awesome plant-based recipes and a list of our services. Email your questions to info@planttrainers.com so we can answer them on our upcoming Facebook Lives. We hope we've inspired you today. Join us again next time, and have a healthy day.